Welcome to this video in the series called Sustainability Bites, where we try to give you bite-sized bits of advice to point you in the right directions in developing approaches to key issues that are required in most sustainability standards. And in this case, we're going to be looking at cultural heritage planning. Now at this point, and you've probably noticed by looking at me, I don't actually identify with any particular Indigenous group. I'm born in New Zealand, raised in the UK, and currently living in Australia, so I cannot identify, and I don't profess to identify with any Indigenous group. I also can't offer you advice on dealing with particular Indigenous groups because I'm not qualified to do that, and that's a very important point and a recurring theme that will crop up throughout this bite. And another thing that's going to crop up a lot is that you need to refer to experts and also properly mandated representatives from Indigenous communities in developing your plan. This bite is really just about the structure of the plan. The finer points of development is something that you're going to have to deal with yourself and also deal with by consultation with affected Indigenous groups or affected people with respect to other maybe non-Indigenous cultural heritage issues. Countries often have defined Indigenous groups or people who relate to an Indigenous group. But also we're going to be dealing with non-Indigenous cultural heritage. So there may be historical things like historic sites or archaeology that represent a link to the past that may or may not be an Indigenous link, but are important because of those links. And because we're talking about a cultural heritage management plan, I'm going to repeat what we said in the management planning bite, which is that you would give an outline of your approach and rather than include procedures within the plan, you'd link to where those procedures occur, operational procedures, for example. So I'm going to go through an outline of how a plan might look, but I'm accepting that situations are different all over the world and yours might look very different. So this is just an outline as an example. Start with definitions. Now, often a sustainability standard has their own definitions and you should include those. But in the case of especially Indigenous cultural heritage, there may be other definitions which the local Indigenous population may relate to. You need to include those as well. Then you start with the scoping statement saying that cultural heritage is important. It's certainly important to Indigenous groups, and within our operations we work with those groups and we have procedures to identify and preserve those sites. And it may not just be sites, it might be artifacts or particular areas in larger areas like waterways, for example, which may be considered to be having more wider cultural values. And then you need to make a statement to say something to the effect that this company will endeavour to identify and all those areas that are of cultural significance and take steps to protect them. Now here's a word about legislation, because in some countries legislation's caught up with the fact that Indigenous values are important, and often in those countries now, especially here in Australia, you've got cultural heritage enshrined and cultural heritage protection enshrined in legislations in certain states. So in your plan you need to say that there is legislation that needs to be followed and then list it, and also that legislation therefore needs to be complied with. And we've done an earlier bite on a legal register and ways in which you keep up with legislation, and obviously that's got to be included in that register, those cultural heritage issues and acts and regulations that you need to follow. Then you need to talk about identifying the Indigenous community. And I'm using the term Indigenous community as a more of a catch-all term. So here in Australia we might be more specific in our plan and talk about identifying the traditional owners. In New Zealand, when you're dealing with Maori as Indigenous community, you might be talking about iwi and also hapu, which are tribes and sub-tribes. So use a specific term for the situation you find yourself in. Having identified the affected individual Indigenous groups, you need to list them. Now one common mistake here is that you need to make strenuous efforts to make sure that you're talking to the properly mandated representatives of those groups, because very often you might sort of look up somebody, or somebody might recommend you talk to somebody, and you say, right, we're talking to that person. And then you get all the way to developing your plan, and another group comes up and says, well, those people don't speak for us. So, we are properly mandated to talk to our community, and they're not. So it's a common mistake, and so it's most important to make efforts to identify the properly mandated representatives at the highest level of the Indigenous community that you're talking to. And you need to do that by talking widely with people, talking to other people who might already relate to those Indigenous communities, local authorities, legislators, or whatever. Make strenuous efforts to identify who the appropriately mandated people are to develop your plan with. That will save you an awful lot of time in the future. Then you need to have a section in your plan about cultural heritage checks. Now that basically means that before any site disturbing activities, or maybe even establishing a new operation, you do cultural heritage checks to see if there are any values that might be impacted by your operations. You might say that at the establishment of the property or of new land or whatever you're doing, there is a cultural heritage check to make sure that you've identified any cultural heritage issues that need to be taken into account. A note here, most people start with some sort of publicly available register of cultural heritage sites that may exist within an authority or whatever. Now, that's okay often for things like historic archaeology or historic buildings or whatever, non-Indigenous cultural heritage. But with Indigenous cultural heritage, you can often run into roadblocks, and sometimes this information is not as good as it could be, and so you need to beware about relying just solely on registers of sites or registers of cultural values. So, for example, here in the south of Australia, it's our sad history that a lot of the Aboriginal groups were effectively exterminated from the southern states and in Tasmania. So a lot of those linkages have been broken, and now there are people who are descendants and who identify with those cultural groups, but they may not know that of the sites that are out there. Having said that, even in that situation, it's an important point to always work with the people identified as the local Indigenous groups, or the people who relate to those Indigenous groups, in order to identify and protect values. And in fact, the standards will explicitly require you to work with Indigenous stakeholders as a priority. Now remember, when you're working with Indigenous groups, you're working in an environment in which you're probably not familiar, and certain cultural values may not, for example, be known, or they may know about them but not want people to know that those sites or values exist because they have a certain sacred value, or quite practically they don't want them disturbed. So sometimes you might not be able, the local Indigenous community might not tell you where the particular sites are. And in addition, and related to that, as in our Australian example, where the connections have been lost to sites in the past, some people, even the local people who relate to the local Indigenous community as descendants, probably don't know where those sites are. So that's something else you've got to consider within your system. And specifically what I mean by that is, if you do identify sites that are not known, that you have a mechanism for getting those sites registered, and also, and most importantly, reintroducing local Indigenous communities to those sites, reconnecting them with those sites. And in those circumstances, you might consider people in your organisation being trained on how to identify those sites and what to look for. And I myself have been through that sort of training, and I can tell you, in terms of identifying Aboriginal cultural heritage sites that may have been lost, there are infinite subtleties of the sort of things that you're looking for at a landscape level that might indicate that you've got a value there that was previously unknown. So training is quite important. System where you've said that you're going to do these cultural heritage checks, you need someone responsible, a manager, a management position responsible for that cultural heritage plan, and an assurance that that there will be no activity that could disturb any values that have been identified. Now, having said that you're going to check for cultural heritage values and also going to be using local community input and possibly experts, what happens if you actually do find cultural heritage values? What do you then do in order to protect those? So having identified those sites, the question is, what are you going to do about them? And you need to outline that in your management plan. And it's very similar to the special values approach that we outlined in the special values management plan. You need to say where those sites are and say what you're going to do to protect them. And very often you put in an exclusion zone in order to make sure those values are preserved, and also, most importantly, you go back to the Indigenous communities and say, this is what we've done to protect these sites. Is that sufficient? And you need to get their approval, if you like, that yes, that is sufficient to protect those values. And as I said before, even if no values are found during the checking phase, it's important to note in your plan that even if no cultural heritage values are found, then they may still be the values there that you might find later, maybe even during operations. So what happens if you're in an operation and you find a cultural heritage value or a cultural site? Well, the first important thing is to stop operations immediately. Then you need to report that find, and as I said before, there may be legislation that outlines how that report needs to be made to the relevant authorities. But, and most importantly, you also need to involve the local Indigenous community to say that there has been a find and that you have stopped operations in order to see how you proceed. Now, at this point, in terms of preserving cultural heritage, I should point out that it's an expectation of standards that in terms of what you need to do, if you found something during the search phase, or if you found something during the operational phase, and you do enlist traditional knowledge or Indigenous knowledge, that you will compensate those people for that knowledge. That's a clear expectation in the standards. So having found something and stopped and reported it, it may be that you get a qualified person into, like an archaeologist or whatever it is, to establish what needs to be done, or an Indigenous expert who maybe also they also have those sorts of skills in terms of identifying those sorts of things, and then take advice on what needs to be done. And so the same thing applies to cultural heritage values that are found during operations, and cultural heritage values that are identified prior to operations. You have to have a management plan on how you're going to deal with them, how you're going to isolate them, maybe on how you're going to protect them. That has to come back into your plan if you found something that you didn't know about before. Now, this is just an outline, and it does bear repeating that the cultural heritage landscape around the world is different, and there may be completely different Indigenous stakeholders. You do need to take advice on how to engage with these stakeholders. In other words, you probably need to consult on how to consult so that you do it in a culturally appropriate way. You also need to find the properly mandated representatives of those stakeholders and involve them at every step in developing and executing your plan. Once again, Pinnacle Quality can help you with the construct or outline of a cultural heritage plan in your circumstances, but we're not qualified to give advice on particular cultural heritage matters in your area. Once again, that is something you need to take up with the traditional owners or First Nations people or whatever that you're dealing with. We wouldn't presume to do that. That is definitely beyond our expertise. So do get in touch with us. Again, we've got an ebook outlining this sort of outline of cultural heritage. So go to our website. Encourage you to have a look at that. And once again, if you like this video, please press like. If you want to share it with people, please press share. And we're very interested in your comments. Thank you again.